Well, I'll start off by introducing myself. I'm Tracy McIntyre. I'm the Director of Communications for the National Museum of Civil War Medicine.
I am Rachel Moses. I am wear many hats: Pry House Manager, Retail Manager, and Collections Manager. So
great, and we're very happy to see we got a good group here this evening to talk about Dr. Mary Walker's Civil War book by Theresa Kaminski. And in about half an hour, Theresa Kaminski will be joining us. We're going to have a little brief discussion before she joins us and see what everybody's opinion was about the book. Does anybody want to get us started? No. No. Okay, well, I'll get us started then. I read this book not really being sure of what I was going to learn. I was hoping to learn a little bit more about Dr. Mary Walker's Civil War experiences. I was a little disappointed that there weren't more experiences that she had in the Civil War. It was kind of tied in with a lot of other information, which, I mean, it helped to put her in a specific place and time and maybe flesh out a little bit of what was going on around her. But I was kind of hoping at the beginning, especially, that there'd be a little bit more information about what she actually did during the Civil War. The latter part of the book I really enjoyed. I had no idea about her suffrage movement stuff. So that was really interesting to me. Looks like Steve's got his hand up. You want to go for it, Steve?
Sure. First of all, I did not get the entire book read yet. I got the date mixed up on my calendar here, so I got a late start on reading it. I'm about 65 pages into it. But really, really enjoying it. And I kind of gathered early, too, that the absence of primary accounts from her perspective, her records, letters, so on, that there's a very minimal amount of that. So it looks like the writer has to do a whole lot of background context, what was happening around her and those closest to her that left a record, to kind of build a story about her. But I like that kind of thing. On a personal level, I've got a ancestor who was a Civil War veteran and lived near Baldwinsville, West Monroe, which is that area between Syracuse and not far from Oswego. So it's that same area. So culturally, a lot of the things she talks about, the changes, I find very interesting. And so I'm looking forward to the rest of the book and hearing what the author has to say.
Great. Yeah, I had that same feeling about there might not be that much primary source information available for her Civil War service. So it was, like you said, it was up to the author to kind of pad things out a bit, give you more information about what was happening around her. So that's probably, that's what I was thinking as well. Anybody else want to add something here? Yes, I says Sylvia's raising her hand there.
Yeah. Sorry, I was like literally raising my hand, not using the actual like little features there. I forget sometimes and everything on Zoom. But yeah, and I found this was a really interesting book, and she was just a really interesting character, but also in some ways a very frustrating character, because like the just the dress reform and trying to push dress reform, I felt like that was a huge distraction from so many other things she was doing and so effective at. So I mean, it's like I totally understand why she wanted to dress that way. I definitely, that looked better to me, but at the same time it just seemed like such a huge distraction. And it's like, strategy wise, I just would have done it differently. And all, it's like, oh, I guess they were taking her side, trying to explain things like that to her, but she was just so independent minded and everything. I admire that at the same time and everything. So I guess I had kind of mixed feelings about her as a person, but she would have been really interesting to meet.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony agree with you about the dress reform being a distraction. Yeah. It was sort of, they had other priorities, I think. And I think they thought that maybe the dress reform would come after they received the right to vote. But I mean, I too get what Dr. Mary Walker was trying to do. And I personally would have been wearing the same outfit if I was a woman back then. But yeah, it's kind of, you kind of want to just take her aside and say, hey, you know, that's a really cool idea, but maybe we want to wait on that.
Yeah, because I just kept thinking, oh, maybe it's because she's a doctor and she's so convinced that it affects health. Maybe that's just kind of the overriding thing that's defining everything for her at that point. Her identity as a doctor or something like that, and then her concerns from the medical. I don't know if that was the best I could ever come up with it.
That's a really good point. She did say it was a health issue as well. Kathy Barnes, I see, has her hand up.
I do, and I am very sorry that you all didn't see the relevance for Dr. Walker for dressing the way she did. She dressed the way she wanted to when she was a child. She worked the farm, and she didn't work the farm in a dress. Also, if you go to the Women's Museum in Seneca Falls, you can see how the women used to dress and how it was really not healthy, especially when you walked through the streets. The bottom of your long dress would pick up all kinds of manure and things in the street and shoot it right up to your butt. So it was really not healthy, and I don't know that it really distracted from her, but it really is something that she wanted to do because she believed in dressing like that for her. She wasn't trying to push it onto anyone. She dressed like that for her, and she was much more comfortable like that. So I'm sorry that you feel that way.
Yeah, I got the feeling that her stance on that was what caused that rift between her and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. I mean, as we were saying, it, you know, her being a doctor, that the fact that it was a health issue, I'm sure really made it super important to her.
My camera, for whatever reason, keeps going in and out. So if I disappear, it's something with my computer. I don't know what's wrong.
Okay, as long as we can still hear you.
Yes, you'll be able to hear me. It's just it keeps blinking out. So.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Technical.
Looks like Diane has a.
Yeah, I wanted to weigh in on the dress, how she dressed, because that was one of the big things I thought of too when all the while I was reading it. And I think because so Amelia Bloom didn't wear her bloomers anymore because she felt that she was becoming associated just with the women's movement at the time, and she felt taken more seriously. So that's what kind of surprised me, that she wanted to dress like a man. And I hate to say this, but I mean, she did go later on to actually dressing like a man. So maybe her reasons were not just, comfort. Maybe she also felt she was in a man's field, doing a man's job, and that was her entitlement to dress that way.
That's a very good point. That's a very good point. Comments from anyone else?
Yeah, the comments about dress and other things too historically here sort of, to me, there are a few parallels to other social movements and other groups that had disagreements about how they should dress to get an audience for the reforms they were advocating. And I mean the civil rights movement is a good example of that in the 50s and early 60s, when much of that was led by Black clergy. That was their mantra for dress, was to look very professional, so that they could gain a first good impression and then make inroads from there. But then you contrast that later in the 60s with groups like the Black Panthers and a lot more attention to African origins, fashions, and styles. There was a big rift there with how do we dress, how do we get access? So I imagine some of that was, it echoes, again, the parallel historically is kind of interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And then there was the whole thing about, I didn't know this, but her White Women's Intelligent Franchise Association, where she, there was that whole thing about white women deserved suffrage more than Black men did. And, that was another rift that I was not aware of at all.
Well, anytime you have people trying to accomplish something, not everybody's going to agree on how to go about it, and in so many different ways. And
yeah, and this was such a radical change, and something that was, took such a long time. It's sort of like people in the peace movement or whatever. Everybody's got their ideas of how best to proceed, and some of the ideas are going to clash, for sure. Sylvia Dove.
And it would seem like too, like with the dress and everything, like in all since me, I think a lot of people at that time would have seen that as kind of ugly and not very attractive. And I think Dorothea Dix would have like totally embraced it and everything, since she didn't want any of these women nurses to be good looking and everything like that. And so you think she would have been totally behind it.
Yeah, she might very well have been. Because she didn't want women going into the hospitals and doing husband hunting. And she didn't want the nurses to be a distraction to the patients. So yeah, I suppose putting the nurses in pants would be a good way to stop both of those things. Other comments from folks about any aspect, not just the dress aspect, but any aspect of the book?
Well, I thought it was interesting that there were so many people referenced in that book that we've been reading about in our book club. You got more perspective on these women in the Civil War and what they were doing and how they may or may not have interacted with the doctor. And I thought that was kind of interesting to have all that brought up and refreshed in my mind as I read it.
Yeah, I have a note here too, to talk about that with the author as well. She mentions that Mary Edwards Walker wrote an article on women soldiers, and the first book we discussed was about women soldiers. They fought like demons, and she in this article she predicts that women would fight in the Civil War, and felt that men prevented women from fighting out of fear that the women would conduct themselves better than the men. So I thought that was a really good comment from Dr. Walker. And also the author, Theresa Kaminski, she mentions about some of the women soldiers we talked about: Mary Galloway, Sarah Emma Edmonds, Loretta Velasquez, and then Dr. Walker meeting Frances Hook, who is a woman soldier as well. And the quote that I really like is, Congress should assign women to duty in the Army with compensation as well as colored men, averring that patriotism has no sex. I like that quote.
Tracy, one thing I thought was interesting, she didn't mention Mary Walker being arrested in Harper's Ferry, did she? Was she not?
She did not, there? And that's something I really want to ask the author. For our audience here, I have read. There's a book by a gentleman named Charles Moulton, who worked in the Provost Marshal's office in Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, during the Civil War. Specifically, I believe it was 1864 was the year he was there. And he writes an account of all of these people that are brought into the Provost Marshal's office, the day-to-day goings on in the town and everything else. And one of the things he writes about is Dr. Walker getting arrested at the train station there. As she disembarked from the train, some of the guards there arrested her for impersonating a man, and they thought she was a spy. So they bring her to the Provost Marshal's office, and she finally convinces them, tells them who she is, and convinces them. And Charles Moulton was saying that, everybody was all embarrassed and everything, because as a surgeon, she outranked them. And so, yeah, that was a really interesting tidbit. I didn't, as Rachel said, I didn't see this little account in this book, maybe because it was just, kind of not one of the major things that happened. But I do want to ask the author if she's aware of that account.
For me, the second part of the book was way more I hate to say it, but just more engaging, because she had so much information on the suffrage movement and I'm interested in that. So that's probably part of my bias as well. But it just seemed like the second part, there was a lot more meat to it.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it was a lot of stuff that I was not aware of that she did. I didn't realize she was as heavily involved in the suffrage movement as she was. Was that a surprise for anybody else?
Was for me. I didn't realize it either.
Yeah, it was for me too.
Me too.
I guess I didn't know that much about her, so I didn't have anything to compare it to. Yeah.
Good point.
I thought it was interesting because I had not heard of this woman until we picked up the book to read it. So I was kind of fascinated in learning about her and was thinking about her challenges. And I know the museum had Dr. Michael Hill come in and reenact being Dr. Augusta.
Yes.
And he was a Black Civil War surgeon, and made me wonder, they both would have had challenges. They weren't allowed to do certain things. And I wondered if they ever kind of crossed paths.
That's a good question. I don't know. I don't know. Maybe the author would know. Yeah, because you often wonder, did these famous people ever cross paths with each other? When we were talking about Susie King Taylor in her memoirs, and we found out that she and Clara Barton actually met. So it's kind of cool to see the interaction of some of these historic personalities, because they didn't exist in a vacuum. They are all there at the same time.
Yes, even Walt Whitman coming into DC.
Yes.
That's interesting. It makes me think, according to, well, I've only read part of the book so far too, but the other key people in the early suffrage movement are sort of mentioned, and she is sort of tangential to that. But I wonder too, and I don't recall, I was at Seneca Falls Museum not too long ago, but I can't recall. So I wonder if anybody else with a better memory or more recent visit, does Mary Walker get much attention at the museum in Seneca Falls?
Ooh, that's a good question. But that museum's on my bucket list. I want to get there eventually, but I have not been. It's
a fascinating place, but I don't recall, but that doesn't mean anything. I forget a lot of stuff, but I'm just curious.
Yeah, has anybody been there? Anybody on the call here been to that museum? Diane? Oh, you're muted. Oops.
I'll speak. Actually,
okay.
Diane and I know each other, and we were both at Seneca Falls this summer.
Oh, great.
And the museum was great, but I don't recall Dr. Mary Walker, but I wasn't aware of her then. So it's quite possible that there might be some picture of her or mention of her, and I wouldn't remember it.
Yeah, because the author kind of says that she was sort of marginalized in the suffrage movement and sort of written out of the history books in a way. So yeah, it does make you wonder, would the suffrage museum actually have something on her? I would hope so. But hey, maybe that's something I need to touch base with the suffrage museum and see if there's anybody there that can tell me, because I'm curious now.
I also really liked how she did not give up on her divorce, how she stayed with it. She would not let her ex-husband off the hook. I thought that was really cool.
very tenacious. Well, I think, she strikes me as somebody that, it's sort of like Clara Barton, who is so independent in her actions and her thoughts, that, she's just going to do what she wants to do. And, if somebody says it's wrong, she's not going to care. So she seems to be similar to Clara Barton in that attitude.
I think I'm finally unmuted.
Oh, there you go. Yep, you are.
So I just want to say that a lot of people kind of, depending on what they had done with the suffrage movement, kind of fell out of favor with the group, because I mean, when we think of, because I try to go there all the time, I really love going to Seneca Falls, and the women's movement, as we know, it was suffrages. We really also, everybody thinks Susan B. Anthony. And I think that's because Elizabeth Cady Stanton became very radical when she started writing her own Bible. And so, when you learn history in school, you don't really hear about Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And she was a really big force behind the whole thing. Yeah. And so I think that could possibly be what happened with Mary Walker. But I don't remember seeing anything there at the museum.
Wow. Well, I would like to think there's at least a mention somewhere.
We'll go there next year and look.
Yeah, I mean, like I say, it's on my bucket list. I definitely want to get up there and check it out, because the whole suffrage movement fascinates me. I've been reading about Alice Paul, it's just, and the hunger strike thing, and it's just truly amazing what all of these women went through.
If you're going to go, you should go during they have convention days, so they do all kinds of talks and everything in July when they're celebrating convention.
Cool. Okay, summer vacation.
Summer vacation, definitely a great place to go.
So we should. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, that's what I remember. Like during the centennial of suffrage and all, I didn't hear anything about Mary Walker either, and I was hearing about all sorts of other like obscure, suffragists I'd never heard of before, but her name didn't come up at all. But I remember.
Wow.
Because I'm here in DC, so there was just a lot of suffrage stuff going on, and like the Hall House. I don't remember anything.
Wow. Yeah, I visited the what was it, the Sewell Paul House in DC.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't remember seeing anything there about Dr. Walker. It was, Alice Paul and all those folks. But yeah, I don't remember seeing anything there either, which is a shame. I used to know one of the rangers that worked there, but he's retired now, unfortunately, or else I'd contact him and say, hey, you need to put something in. So we should have Theresa Kaminski joining us shortly. Rachel, you said 7:30, correct?
Yes, she is due to be on in a few minutes.
Okay. Okay. I was really also pleased to see some other things that Dr. Walker did. For example, assisting soldiers with legal matters and their desertion charges and things like that. I had no clue she would do that. That's pretty amazing, considering, she didn't have a law degree or anything. And that helping to establish the Invalid Corps, or the Veterans Reserve Corps. I didn't realize that she had a hand in that. I studied the Veteran Reserve Corps briefly. I used to be a reenactor, and one of my impressions was Veteran Reserve Corps, and I was at Ford's Theater for the 150th, portraying a Veterans Reserve Corps soldier. And I had no idea she had any connection at all to them. And that's really, really neat.
Does anybody know how the author actually found Dr. Walker? I was kind of interested in that.
Do not know, so you can ask her.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know either.
I just found it fascinating. I'd never heard of this lady, and I'm pretty widely read on women in history, but not her.
Yeah, it's interesting when I'm giving tours at the museum. I always mention Dr. Mary Walker when I'm talking about the men attending the medical schools, and you know, there were a certain number of schools in the country and only 2 accepted women, and blah blah. And I always say, you know, the most famous woman surgeon in the Civil War was Dr. Mary Edwards Walker, and 99% of the people don't know who I'm talking about.
Yeah. Is she
Which is
still the
really sad.
only female awarded the Medal of Honor even up to now? Do you
Yes.
know? Okay,
Yes.
even
The
now.
only
Okay.
female recipient of the Medal of Honor.
Wow.
And it had to be, it was taken away from her, as we know from the book, and it had to be reinstated. You know, back in I think it was the 70s. President Jimmy Carter was the one that
blew my mind. I thought she got it reinstated way before that, and it was like, really? It was that late?
Yeah, I mean,
That shocked
she
me.
was, I believe she was buried wearing it, because she was so determined to hang on to it, and good for her. But yeah, it wasn't until the 70s that it had to be, that was reinstated. But yeah, no other woman has received it.
It was a fascinating story of how they argued back and forth about whether to give her something. And it seems like President Jackson seemed to really want to do something, even though others did not. It was kind of fascinating, that little story.
Yeah, I found that interesting too. And the circumstances of her, you know, getting captured and everything. I knew she had been captured. I just didn't realize that, you know, she was constantly risking capture, going out to treat all the civilians in enemy territory. And I had no idea that, you know, that was actually how she got captured. And then she was imprisoned. And the horrible suffering in the prison, just, you know, I had no idea of any of that. I just knew she had been captured and imprisoned in Richmond, but I didn't know all the details. So that was really interesting to read.
We do have the author. I'm going to go ahead and let her log on. So she will be joining us just in a second.
Okay, great.
Okay, so we do have the author on with us. I apologize, my camera is not working correctly, so it keeps going in and out. But Tracy, do you want to go ahead and do a quick little intro on her, and then we
Sure.
can open it up for questions?
Excellent. All right. Well, I am very pleased to welcome Theresa Kaminski to our book club meeting this evening. Theresa holds a PhD in history from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and for more than 25 years, she worked as a history professor at a state university, where she taught courses on American women's history, feminism and women's rights, and women in war. She's the author of a trilogy of nonfiction history books on American women in the Philippine Islands during World War II, the most recent of which is Angels of the Underground, the American Women Who Resisted the Japanese in the Philippines in World War II, which sounds fascinating. I think I'll probably get a copy of that. She's currently completing the first full-length biography of America's favorite cowgirl, Dale Evans. Theresa lives with her husband in a small town outside of Madison, Wisconsin, and we are very pleased to have her here with us this evening.
Thank you all. I appreciated the invitation.
Great. Well, let's open it up to questions. We had a couple of, in our introductory discussion here, we had a couple of folks that had expressed some questions. So let's take them.
Should we ask her where she found Dr. Walker first?
There you go.
Well, actually, I should say the credit for the book project itself goes to one of the editors at Lyons Press, who was, she'd been working on a book about Medal of Honor winners. And she was surprised when she went to look at things about Mary Walker that there were very few things published about her. It's not that I wrote the first book on Mary Walker, but she thought it was time for a new one. And I had run across her name over the years because I taught courses on feminism. I taught courses on women in war. So she was always kind of a minor character in those stories. And then this biography gave me the opportunity to make her the major character.
We had somebody else had a question. No.
I have another one if no one else does.
Okay, go for it.
I mentioned this to the group earlier. We've been reading about women in the Civil War, and what I found fascinating about your book and how you structured it, you put a lot of stories about these women in the war to kind of set the background so that we understood where Mary Walker was, journeying during that time. And I just found that really fascinating. Did you know about all these extra women, or did they come up in your research?
Yeah, a little bit of both. Again, a lot of these women that I bring up in the book, especially the ones that she encountered during her medical career, these were women I really had to dig for information on. They very rarely show up in any kind of more mainstream, even women's history books. I mean, these were women who had, and this does kind of get to the point of my book, which is that in some ways Mary Walker was a very average woman in some of the things that she did, in the fact that she didn't end up with this big national long-lasting reputation. She just went out there and worked and did what she thought she needed to do. And I wanted to weave in the lives of other women who were like her, who don't get big names in big history books, to show that this is just part of women's lives. This is just part of what women have been doing throughout history. And it was fascinating research, just trying to dig out as much as I could about these women.
Yeah, the first book that we had here on our book club was They Fought Like Demons by Deanne Blanton and Lauren Cook. And we had Lauren Cook on to talk about her research and the women soldiers that they had found. And I was so happy to see you put them in this book. And the fact I did not know that that Dr. Walker had written an article arguing that women should fight in the war. I thought that was really awesome. I did not know that. And I love that she met Frances Hook in the hospital there. I thought that was really, really neat because Frances Hook is, my friend and I give talks on women soldiers, and we're friends with Deanne and Lauren. And so any women soldier stuff that we find is really fascinating. And I was really, really psyched to see that Mary Walker had an interaction with a woman soldier. That was neat.
Yeah, and I had read quite a bit on the women who disguised themselves as men and went to serve. And Mary Walker certainly wasn't against that. I think she very much understood the motivations of these women. But I think that her overall point about women in the military was that women shouldn't have to do that. They should not have to pretend to be something that they weren't in order to make the kind of contribution that they believed was necessary for the war effort. And yeah, I think she was very sympathetic to women who were trying different ways to show their support for the United States government.
Yeah, that was really really neat. And I was also surprised that I was saying earlier to the folks here about the fact that she did some other things that I was not aware of. For example, help create the Invalid Corps, the Veterans Reserve Corps. I didn't know she was involved with that at all. That was a surprise. and the fact that she was assisting soldiers with their legal matters, the desertion charges and things. I had no idea about that either. Was that a surprise to you to find
It
those?
was, it was. And again, it makes sense just given the kind of person that she was. Once she started being a doctor to the soldiers, she just saw her role as being as expansive as possible. And I think that this is the reason why, even in her later years after the war, she was always willing to help when a soldier got in touch with her about pension issues, anything that she could help with, she was willing to do. And she was also very famously or infamously willing to make a pest out of herself in Washington, D.C. to get what she wanted. And she did this for suffrage, and she did this for veterans as well. And that one of the things that really surprised me was that post-war meeting that she went to of the tri-state veterans, where they actually had her up on the stage along with them. And I think that that was probably something that carried her through the rest of her life as an acknowledgement of what she did during the war, that these men who had actually been in uniform gave her that particular honor.
Mm-hmm. That she had been accepted for her service. Yeah.
Right. And of course, that wasn't universal. I don't want to make this sound like it was, some miraculous achievement or something, because she always had her detractors everywhere she went, everything she was doing, whether it was in the medical field or whether it was for her suffrage work. She ran up against people who did not like her, did not believe in what she was doing, but she never gave up. She was very single-minded, and yeah, she was pretty tenacious.
Yeah, we were discussing about the rift that she had between Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony over the dress reform issue, and that was a surprise to me. You kind of think that maybe all the women's suffrage advocates would all hang together, but clearly not.
No, and I had known of some of these rifts in the movement, and I had known, for example, that when Stanton and Anthony were putting together their history of the suffrage movement, that they were very clearly creating a history that was flattering to themselves and not necessarily, again, being, and it's of course very ironic given what they were working toward, but not being very egalitarian in who they recognized. And it's not that Mary Walker was left out of the history, but she was really relegated to a very minor role. And you're right, a lot of that, Tracy, was about disputes over dress reform, over Mary Walker's outspokenness about divorce, and also her views about that constitutional amendment for suffrage and her particular reading of the Constitution. She was adamant for the rest of her life that she was right about the Constitution, that it already gave women voting rights and Congress just had to make it so. And she just wouldn't give up on that.
Mm-hmm. We have a couple of our viewers here who have been to the Women's Suffrage Museum in Seneca, New York, and I was asking them if they had seen any reference to Mary Walker up there, and neither one of them could remember.
It's been a few years since I've been to Seneca Falls, and I have to say it was one of my favorite places to visit. It's they've done a really nice job there, but I don't remember in the museum if I saw anything about her there, because of course it would be very, very heavy with Stanton and Anthony lore there. But there's also a very good book, and it may be listed somewhere in my book, but there's a book that was published a few years ago called The Myth of Seneca Falls, which does a really good job at getting behind the well-publicized history of the suffrage movement and exposing more of these divisions and why they happened and what the result was for the movement. It's a really good book, and it's not aimed at, taking down anybody, but really aimed at, trying to get a more balanced version of what was going on there, that it wasn't all Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, that there were a lot of other voices and a lot of other women involved in this.
Yeah, I'd been to the Sewell Paul House in Washington, D.C., and there was no reference to Dr. Walker there either.
Yeah, she was not very fond of Alice Paul's whole contingent, which again, I thought just was, it may have been, it may have been a function of age, because you think if Mary Walker had been a young woman in 1913, she might have looked at that very differently than she did as, a very elderly person, because it certainly had the kind of radical action that she normally would have approved of. But I think by that point in her life, maybe she was just tired, and yeah, it was kind of a shock to her that they were taking these kinds of steps and they weren't listening to her again, I think is the main thing.
Right. Any of our viewers have any questions? I don't want to monopolize the conversation.
I have another question. I don't want to dominate here, but the book really was kind of interesting to me. It was fascinating that in the pictures that you showed and included in your book had pictures of Dr. Walker looking more and more like a man. Can you comment about what you found in that regard?
Very little, which is not unusual. And there's another book just recently out, and right now I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the title, but it is about the suffrage supporters who were either lesbians or like Dr. Walker, maybe more ambivalent about their sexuality. And the book has the cover photo of that book is of Mary Walker later in life in her more masculine dress. And when I say that there's very little to find out about that, and this is something that women's historians have encountered for decades now when trying to find out about the lives of non-heterosexual women, is that especially when you go back into the 19th century, these were just things people didn't talk about it, and they didn't even write about it. You may think, well, if she left behind letters or something, even in private writings, women would have been very reluctant to be explicit about these matters. And this would have been true of heterosexual women as well. You don't find a whole lot of 19th century women talking about, their sex life. They just didn't do it. So what we have left then is how Mary Walker chose to present herself, which is often a big clue. I mean, the way we dress, the way we present ourselves out in public and even in private can often be a reflection of who we see ourselves as. And again, I think I use the word ambivalent. And this may, I think, characterize Dr. Walker, because on the one hand, when commenting about her mode of dress, remember, she was always pushing back against the notion that she wore men's clothing. Even one time very famously responding, well, I'm a woman and these are my clothes, so how could I be wearing men's clothing? Okay. Which I think is very telling in one way. And yet, you're right, as she got older, that what had started off as that bloomer costume from the 1850s turns into very clearly masculine tailored trousers and the long coat, the top hat. So she was clearly more comfortable presenting herself like that. I know from her writings, she had a lot of female friends. It's difficult to say what those friendships entailed. But again, there's nothing that anybody's been able to find so far that she specifically said something about her own sexuality. We know she married a man. She was married, and apparently the only reason for that, the end of that marriage, was that he was unfaithful, and that bothered her. And even when he gave her the option of doing the same thing. Remember, he basically says to her, well, if you want to do what you want to do, that's fine with me. And she was really appalled by that. So what we're left with then are really different signals here from her.
Right. And she ended up cutting her hair short
Right.
towards the end of her life. And I like that that little story about that where she had to let her hair down to prove she was a woman.
Right. Yeah.
And that was because everybody was thinking she was a man because a woman couldn't possibly know all the things that she knew, and she had to be a man, but the only way she could prove she wasn't was to let her hair down.
Yeah.
And then it was interesting that later on in her life she ended up cutting it.
Yeah, and even when she did that, even as an older woman, remember, in the 1910s, there were some women bobbing their hair, but they would have been very young women. That was a craze that was started among, teens and 20s, and then that carried through into the 1920s and 1930s. So for her to cut her hair like that at her age, again, it's it does raise this question of what kind of message was she trying to send? We don't know.
Right. And we'll never know.
No. And then that comes back. Does it matter? Does it have anything to do with her accomplishments? No, but to get to know her as a private person, and maybe that's something for us today, growing up in the late 20th century into the 21st century, we're kind of more accustomed to being able to find out all these things about people's private lives, whereas back in the 1800s, that wouldn't have been a very common thing. If somebody didn't want to talk about something, they just didn't.
Right. And I come across that too when giving talks about women soldiers, and one of the soldiers that we talk about is Albert Cashier or Jenny Hodgers. And in the past few years, that particular soldier has been held up as sort of a hero of the transgender community. But I mean, we argue that there's no way you would know. Why did Albert Cashier continue to be a man after the war? Was it because Albert could vote and own property and get a veteran's pension, or was it because Albert truly did want to be a man? And because Albert was illiterate, there's no way of ever knowing. Albert never left any kind of record or anything. So it's just you can't say in that case. And so it's kind of a disservice to make somebody an icon of a community that they might not in general have been part of.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that historians are pretty careful about too, and that's an issue that comes up a lot. And again, not to mix up wars here, but since we're talking about female soldiers, another really good book is there's a biography of a woman named Deborah Sampson, who dressed as a man to join the American Revolution, and the historian Alfred Young just did a marvelous job of getting into the details of her life, exactly why she did this and what kinds of benefits she got later in life. And it's a great story. And it also addresses many of these same issues that we've been talking about that still come up then with women, 100 years later. So some of these same issues. So, yeah, you can easily go back to the American Revolution and find women doing the same kinds of things to get involved in the war as they would during the Civil War. And Mary Walker just wanted to make it so women wouldn't have to do that anymore, that they wouldn't have to go through all of that.
Yeah, they wouldn't have to disguise themselves and take a male alias. They could just go as themselves and be accepted.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Theresa, this is Steve Gates, and first of all, I confessed earlier too, I haven't finished the book. I'm about 65 pages in, but finding it very interesting, and I will be finishing it. And I signed up for the book, got the book, and signed up for this chat because I have a lot of related interests in this area, and I've also participated in a couple of the other previous book talks here from earlier this year and last year. And Tracy's comment about Albert Cashier, alias Albert Cashier, and then looking at Mary Walker, they're sort of on the far extremes of the edges here of, to me, my perspective, of all those who were in some way, shape, or form involved in this whole era of change and suffrage in different ways. And I found Jenny's life, Albert Cashier, fascinating, because if you read more about her life, that was the only identity she really ever affiliated with, because their parents were extremely poor, and even when they left Ireland, come over here, then dressing the children as boys because they could get jobs, and it becomes more apparent that's the only identity she ever affiliated with, and everything else was just foreign. And what I've learned so far about Mary Walker's, she achieved quite a degree of success within the given culture at the time, professionally, with what she achieved as a doctor and in medicine and other related things at a fairly early age. And so she's already gained some success in that, but yet is advocating for lots of changes, sort of on a personal and immediate level with her life situation. Again, I'm only up to about the Civil War, but the many experiences she's had where she had to fight her own battles to make a point and overcome something, and she's doing that from the position of professional achievement, that distinguishes her a little bit from some of the other suffrage leaders later on, who had, to some extent, they were sort of conventional in some respects, because their husbands were fairly well off and doing well, and some would say they had the benefit of that while they were out advocating for something different. But so I find these two, extremes, and everybody else is sort of in the middle here.
Yeah, and I think, your points are very well taken, and I think that well, you're right. What did distinguish Mary Walker is when she was doing all of these things. I mean, she did them because she was a professional. She was a doctor. She had a degree, but she wasn't doing them just for herself alone. I think she always had in mind that she was at the beginning of what she hoped would be a long line of women coming after her, that there would always be more women in medical school following her, that there would always be more women who would actually get into the military, that, at some point, what she had done was going to matter to the military so much that they would break down those barriers, and that the fact that she wore trousers, that, and even by the time she died in 1918, she would have seen that some young women were starting to wear trousers out in public, if only for sports related things, women bicycling, playing tennis, playing croquet. They would at least be able to wear what was more appropriate to their activity. So she saw these kinds of changes, and I think that's what she was about. It wasn't just for herself, it was for other women too. And certainly she knew with the suffrage movement, she wasn't working for voting just for herself, and that it was going to be other women as well. But she did want to make sure that other women's rights would then be coming after that first major step with suffrage, the divorce laws that would change. And I think that was something that continued to concern her for the rest of her life, the problems that women had if they happened to marry the wrong person. And how that could tie up their lives and the lives even of any children that they would have. And I think that's why Mary Walker continued to be concerned about women's health issues and healthcare issues throughout her life. It wasn't just about the soldiers, it was about other people's health as well.
Right. Well said. Yeah. Okay, so we have about a minute left. Anybody else have any final questions, comments?
I was just going to ask you, Theresa, a somewhat related question. I just discovered you have a nonfiction book related group on Facebook.
I do.
I signed up for it.
Great.
So I'm hoping you refer me to other good books to read, or maybe you have some other book chats to participate in too.
Sure. And I'll tell everybody else too that if you do Facebook, there's a group on there called Nonfiction Fans, and I co-run it with a friend of mine who also writes nonfiction, most of it about women. And most of the books that we read and recommend to each other tend to be on women's history topics. It's very heavily skewed in that direction. So you'll find a lot of good recommendations for a variety of books there. And anybody is welcome to sign up. So that would be great. It doesn't cost anything. We don't sell anything on there. We just love to read and talk about nonfiction books, especially history.
Ooh,
Yeah,
that
I'm gonna
sounds
have to
good.
join.
I'm signing up.
Me too.
Good.
Me too.
Wonderful.
Good. And I do just want to mention the book about, for those of you who are of a certain age, the book on Dale Evans is out. It came out in 2022. So yeah, that one I added to my done list.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. Yeah, I wasn't sure how up to date that biography was that I read out. But yeah, and on a personal note, my mom who passed in 2020, she actually knew Dale Evans and was in the rodeo with Roy Rogers.
Oh my goodness.
I will definitely have to pick up your book on Dale Evans.
Wow. It's a small world when you start
Yes.
talking about Dale Evans.
Indeed, indeed. All right. Well, anything else anybody wants to say before we sign off?
It was
Okay,
a
well,
good book. I enjoyed it.
Thank you very much. I really so much appreciate you all taking the time to read it and to talk about it. It just, that's what makes the writing worthwhile. So thank you very much.
Teresa, so
Thank
much
you.
for joining us. I really appreciate it. I'm sorry, my camera's broken, but I'm Rachel. I'm the one that's been emailing you. So
I really like your artwork there, Rachel.
yeah, she doesn't
very
look like
much.
the logo in real life.
that is actually what I look like. Like I walk around and I'm a logo.
But yes, thank you so much, Theresa, for joining us. And I'm so happy to have read your book. I learned so much about Dr. Walker that I had no idea. And that's what I love about history books, is learning something new. So I want to thank everybody for tuning in, and we will continue the book club next year. And we have come up with our list of books, and we've signed up some authors to speak. The next book we're going to be doing is going to be in January after the new year. And we will be sending out notices for this and also posting it on our website. The book is called The Woman They Could Not Silence, and it's by Kate Moore. And it's about Elizabeth Packard and her amazing story of being committed by her husband to an insane asylum and having to prove she was not insane, and her efforts to reform mental institutions. And this is all during the Civil War. So that is going to be our book for January. Again, we'll be putting out notices about that. So again, thank you all for joining us. Thank you so much, Theresa, again, for joining us. And have a good evening, all.
Good night, everyone.
Good
Thank
night.
you all.